on this Friday, May 2nd, 2014 edition of the Hagmann Report. Our special guest, W, the Intelligence Insider. If you're wondering what any of this has to do with intelligence or how it connects the dots, just hang with us. I guarantee you will be absolutely astounded when you hear how this is all tied together. Please listen to this carefully because this is going to set the tone, I believe, for tonight. And the quote is this: in order to properly understand the big picture, everyone should fear becoming mentally clouded and obsessed with one small section of truth. I got to tell you, folks, the Starbucks is a requirement for this man. So for those who don't know you have lived your life in the recesses, the shadows. I'm not going to get into everything that you've done, obviously, but suffice it to say that you're the real James Bond in my book, and someone of a man of integrity, character, and a guy that I would trust my life with. So we're going to just turn it over to you and just take us where you want to take us.
Tonight, I want to talk more theory, history, the physics, try to get in the mind where some of the folks are coming from, how they got there, that are running the planet right now, and why they think what they do, where it makes sense, where there's actually some pretty good logic that got them there potentially. And then for others of our listeners, I think it's a very important detail. We have a lot of Christians. Your show is aimed at Christians, and so my presentation is really aimed at them tonight in a large measure. For non-believers, agnostics, you might get a very good clue of why even your beliefs are maybe well-founded in some ways. So I'm not just talking to Christians, but what I'm concerned about is a lot of times we hear trigger words. For example, let's just use Richard Hoagland last week, and I think some people were upset by some of what he said or heard key trigger words like astrology, and they were like, oh, that's evil, and they're instantly, tune him out. He's from the devil. He's not talking about anything I want to hear about. And they can't take a deep breath and try to understand, even if you disagree, what underlying principles, information he might have been trying to convey there, and then how it feeds into and is relevant to us. Because remember, it's not what you believe. It's what they believe who are running the planet right now that is really affecting how we live. Because at this exact moment, the people that have the controls, they're, a different group. And so we're trying to understand what's driving them, what's directing them, what are the principles, what are the ideas that cause them to think, function, do what they do, and what is the mindset or even the mind behind them that has gotten them and us here today, right now, where we are, with all these events churning around us in the world and these burning questions arising and propelling us ahead, seemingly to this new world order, just ahead, just around the corner. What's the driver? What do they believe? What's driving them? How do we get there? We're going to take a lot of wild twists and turns, and I hope I can pull it all together and make it make sense.
Let's rock and roll. Buckle up.
All right. When the pharaohs were entombed, when they'd passed away, and the wealthy people of Egypt, we now know, we go back and we look at these sarcophaguses and the burial chambers, etc. We know that the whole death process was a very elaborate process. They went to extreme measures to mummify these individuals of prominence, these people that they felt were godlike or, in fact, gods. We look at it now with a modern mind and we think, well, they're just nuts, crazy. They were gods. I mean, how the height of arrogance. We have to think about it a little bit more. What were they really trying to do when they preserved their body in this way? And not just themselves, but then they had elaborate systems where they buried sailboats, complete sailboats, all dismantled and carefully packed away and stored underground for them. And we've gone back and discovered these items. Oftentimes they were buried with their wives and servants. And they were also preserved with the understanding, with the belief that one day they were going to be resurrected and would live again physically. And we look at it and we think with our modern minds that a little touched. They didn't understand the nature of the world. As Christians, they didn't understand salvation. Christ hadn't arrived yet. They believed in, voodoo. But then there's another interesting thing. Let's walk away from that for a moment and go somewhere else. The Smithsonian received the bones of giants. And there have been numerous accounts over the last century and a half of people, individuals, groups who turned over these bones and artifacts from burial chambers and burial sites that were from giants. Smithsonian, you go back and you ask them, hey, what happened with those bones? Oh, we destroyed them. Yeah, they're gone. They're history. Don't have them. Don't know what you're talking about. Who are you? Well, no, we know you got them. Well, you don't know nothing. Places all over the world, there's been this allegation out there for some time that some hidden hand group has been systematically gathering up all of these old bones. Why? And why not admit it? But let's step aside from that for a minute and let's look at another situation. What is consciousness? Where are you? Think about it right now. We hear near-death experiences by people all the time who have passed over out of their body, and they give very credible explanations of how they rose out of their body, had a physical form. They saw things in an operating room, for example, that you could not have seen from where they were lying physically in their body. Conversations, words that happened in a hallway just outside the door that you had to be there to hear it. And people say that they heard this word or that conversation or saw this person dressed a certain way, and they were in the operating room on the table. And very difficult to deny that they had had an experience that wasn't just an experience inside of the tissue of their gray matter, their brain, that they had somehow been transported or allowed to move about outside of their physical corpse. So then we ask ourselves, where are we? Where's our consciousness? Are you right now actually in your physical body? Or is it possible, is it conceivable, that your conscious is somewhere maybe within the parameters of your physical body and more, but not technically really inside your physical body? I have remote control devices, including one of our aircraft that we're working on that's remote control. It is capable of traveling very fast, very far. And yet some of its operations are pre-programmed, and it operates autonomously on its own within its own computer program inside its computers. But then there's other overriding information that comes remotely that is broadcast to the aircraft, and it gives information, and there's more broadcast to it. And so the real mind behind the operation of that aircraft could be at a great distance from the aircraft. Technically, it could be to the moon or to outer planets, distant, and yet still be operated remotely. The real mind isn't in the aircraft, although it's physically expressing itself through that aircraft. So where's that consciousness? The world around us, and we say, no, the body, the consciousness, the physical, we're right here. I'm right here. But let's diverge again for just a moment. Years ago, before cloning was actually really known outside of a very tiny realm of people, there was a particular location where we were examining cloning issues. There was a dog that had been a pet, and that dog had been well known and would greet aircraft as they arrived and departed, and the crews knew him. And he was very well liked, had a very unique personality, did some tricks, and he was just great. When he passed away, he was buried in this very arid semi-desert environment. So years later, at a certain point, somebody had the idea that it'd be interesting to see if we could clone. So he was exhumed and DNA was extracted from different areas of the corpse in bone areas and in teeth areas, because those areas hold DNA, preserve it longer than most of the other areas. And there were some other samples taken, but those were really key. And then the animal was cloned. And in one of the clones that was done, that there was health issues with some of them early on, and it took a little time to get things right. In one of them that was done, it was noticed that the dog operated mannerism-wise, and even to some tricks that it did as it was maturing, as though it already knew these tricks that were really unique to its ancestor. And the question was, did that animal have that information in its DNA? Was that knowledge of how to do the tricks something that was recorded somehow in the DNA? Had the DNA been overwritten during the course of the dog's life to be able to know a trick, and it somehow is recorded there like information, like writing a movie onto a DVD or something and recording it on the DVD? Had it somehow been recorded on the DNA? Conversely, the question was there something in the DNA that predisposed the dog to want to behave or operate or do things really just like the other dog, even to the paths it wanted to go down and this daily routine that the ancestor had? None of those seemed to make sense, because the behaviors that we were looking at, that we're talking about, are learned behaviors. They did not seem to be things that you would have had within its DNA, how the animal was built at a structural level. This was more information-related, things that would have been recorded in the mind, that would have been recorded in ways that it's like the difference between, with the old reel-to-reel tapes, you have the tape itself that can hold information, but then you have to write information on it. And when you play it back, you get the information you wrote on it. You don't get new tape suddenly coming out of the tape machine, because you're not manufacturing tape. You're just downloading the information that was recorded on it, writing it on, taking it off. The question was, how could this dog have known these tricks? How could it want to follow these same paths when it hadn't been taught this stuff? It had not been shown it, really, to that point in time. But because of some health issues that were raised, the dog had started to get sick. And this was early on, and people really, they're monitoring it very closely. These are scientists having some fun while they're doing other real research. But this was a question that came up during this time that the previous dog wouldn't have known, because the facilities are newer and had some new stuff and different people. So that animal died. And they had decided to clone that animal. So now we have a clone of a clone. Plus we had still some work going on with the previous clone. And the interesting thing was to try and determine if there was some recorded information in the clone of the clone that was transmitted from one to the other. Now, the background for that was there was also simultaneous work being done where they had taken earthworms, another group, but certainly we were aware of it. And this other group had taken these earthworms, and they had taught them that when there was certain stimuli, electrical stimuli within a box of materials, that if they went a certain direction, there would be food. So they essentially literally trained these earthworms, which you would think they have very little gray matter, brain, whatever, to do anything. But in their opinion, they had trained these earthworms to respond in a certain way to certain types of stimuli. Then they ground up these earthworms and fed them to other earthworms. And they noticed that without learning the behavior, the other earthworms began to operate in the same way. That something in the material that was transferred from one to the other, actually that information somehow went to the next set of earthworms, and they were able to essentially be trained just by exposure to the material, the biomaterial of these other earthworms, the DNA, if you will, got inside their system. So these were really, wild questions. I mean, this is, strange stuff. Believe me, we'll get to the politics in a little while. We'll get to today in the world around us in a little while. But let's think about this question. Now this dog, who's a clone of a clone, and another dog that's just another clone of the original, are being raised isolated from each other. And an interesting thing is learned. The clone of a clone, as well as the original, both show some knowledge, some predisposition, acknowledgement of how to do a trick that had only been learned by that first clone. So how could a clone of the original dog and a clone of the clone both know this new same trick when there was no physical contact between them, there was no learned information between them, not being raised around that dog at the middle? So that got me thinking, asking the question, well, what's the nature of consciousness? This is a very long time ago. I mean, this is a long time ago. Coming at it from a spiritual side, I said, well, but the consciousness isn't inside the body. It's coming from a remote location. Now, to most physicists, they're just looking at a brain and saying, nope, it's right there. It's the cells right there. There's a gray matter. We know this part of the brain transmits neurons this way, and it registers information here, and this is how it works. And they're looking totally inside the brain. They're looking inside the DNA as little recorders to see how it could be registered on the DNA and be written on the DNA. And I'm going, yeah, but the original, how could it possibly know it? How could twins know something happened to their genetically same person at a distance, even though they had no contact? We have lots of stories of twins where they seem to know when their twin is in trouble or hurt or what they're thinking and know the thought even before they do it. Well, is it because of close contact while they're being raised? But in some cases, twins were separated at birth or shortly thereafter, and yet they know that they have a twin somewhere. They think thoughts with the other twin. They live lives that are somehow similar. To a university professor, that's the same as to a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters here, same as saying astrology, astrology, astrology. And the cross comes out, and they start making signs, and they're all stressed out. But I'm trying to come at this and look at it and go, is there a real physics that, even if it isn't understood, is there a real physics, an underlying testable, measurable, tangible physics here that we have to know, understand, grasp? And sometimes you have to think bigger, oftentimes, and sometimes you have to think smaller. I'm going to bring all of these things together before we're done, but I hope your audience is staying with us. I know some people, their brains are already getting a little overheated, but stick with us. I think we can pull it together. So now we say, okay, so there's stuff that makes up our world, but we can't see it. But it's everywhere around us, totally infused in us. And it's even more real than the stuff that we see because it's much denser, it's much finer, it's much more powerful. And in fact, if you were to say that you could perfectly use the dark matter just contained in your own body, besides boiling all the oceans of the world off with just a cup of it that might be the size of your fist,